You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 10, Zombie Island. Part 1. The Island's Secret. The dim lecture hall buzzed with anticipation, its seats filled with students and professors, some curious, others skeptical. Dr. Nathan Wells stood at the podium, a tall, lean figure with graying hair that framed sharp, intelligent eyes. His movements were deliberate, his tone passionate but tinged with an undercurrent of obsession. Behind him, a large screen displayed an image of an ant with a spindly fungal stalk erupting from its head. "This," Nathan began, his voice steady yet compelling, "is Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, the so-called zombie fungus, a parasitic organism that infiltrates its host, manipulates its behavior, and ensures its own propagation through the host's demise." He paused, letting the image sink into the room's collective mind. The faint rustle of notebooks and murmured conversations died away. The infected ant climbs to an elevated position, compelled by the fungus. Once there, it anchors itself with a death grip, ensuring it stays in an ideal spot for fungal spores to spread. This, my friends, is a masterclass in evolution. Nathan's fascination was evident. He gestured to a new slide showing a colony of ants behaving erratically under fungal influence. "Cordyceps," he said, "is not just a killer, it's a puppeteer. It turns its victims into tools, their lives reduced to mere vehicles for its survival." The audience reacted with a mixture of awe and discomfort, some leaning forward with intrigue, others recoiling at the grotesque implications. Nathan's enthusiasm intensified. "Imagine," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "what this fungus could do if it evolved. What if it could affect more than insects? What if—" He stopped himself, the glimmer in his eye betraying a mix of excitement and something darker. After the lecture, Nathan retreated to his cramped office. Stacks of papers covered his desk, interspersed with fungal specimens preserved in glass jars. The faint scent of alcohol and decayed wood lingered in the air. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was a graduate student with a tip, rumors of an uncharted island off the California coast with a unique fungal ecosystem. Nathan's mind raced. An unspoiled biome, untouched by modern hands? The prospect was irresistible. He booked his trip the same evening, his hands trembling with a mix of eagerness and apprehension. Nathan's boat rocked gently on the ocean as the island loomed ahead, shrouded in mist. He gripped the edge of the boat, his knuckles white against the salt-crusted wood. The island was smaller than he'd imagined, its dense jungle pressing against the rocky shoreline like a green, breathing wall. The faint cries of seabirds echoed over the waves, punctuated by the rhythmic lap of water against the hull. Disembarking, Nathan stepped onto the soft, damp earth. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin and filling his lungs with the scent of decaying vegetation. The jungle seemed alive, not just with the rustle of leaves or the chirping of insects, but with an almost palpable energy. He adjusted his satchel, checking his equipment: vials for samples, a magnifying glass, and a small camera. Each step into the jungle revealed new marvels. Bioluminescent fungi glowed faintly on tree trunks, casting an otherworldly light in the dim undergrowth. Strange, spindly mushrooms sprouted in clusters, their caps shimmering with an iridescent sheen. Nathan bent down to examine a particularly unusual specimen, its stalk curling in a spiral. He pulled out his camera, snapping photos from multiple angles. "Remarkable," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the jungle's hum. Deeper into the forest, the air grew thicker, the light dimmer. Nathan's attention was drawn to movement on the ground. A line of ants, their movements erratic and disjointed. He crouched, watching as one ant veered off course, climbed a nearby plant, and clamped its mandibles onto a leaf. His breath caught as he noticed the fungal stalk protruding from its head. The tiny sporangium at its tip pulsed faintly, releasing a fine mist of spores. Nathan leaned closer, his heart racing. The jungle offered more grotesque sights. Spiders twitched unnaturally, their legs jerking in unison as if pulled by invisible strings. One collapsed before his eyes, and within minutes, a thin, white filament emerged from its body, growing with alarming speed. Nathan recorded everything, his fingers deftly working the camera and notepad. His fascination overrode his unease, his mind racing with hypotheses. How had the fungus adapted so efficiently to its hosts? What genetic mechanisms enabled such precise control? As the hours passed, Nathan ventured further into the jungle. He stumbled upon a clearing, its floor littered with the remains of infected creatures. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Corpses frozen in grotesque poses, fungal growths bursting from their bodies like alien sculptures. It was here that Nathan first noticed something unusual. Amid the smaller creatures, the remains of a mouse caught his eye. Its body was rigid, its eyes clouded over, and a faint fungal growth extended from its skull. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he examined the specimen. "No," he whispered, disbelief and excitement mingling in his voice. "It can't be." He took a sample, carefully sealing it in a vial. The implications were staggering. Could the fungus adapt to mammals? The thought sent a chill down his spine, but he quickly dismissed it. It was likely a one-off occurrence, a random mutation with no broader significance. The sky began to darken, and the jungle's cacophony grew louder, more menacing. A storm was brewing. Nathan packed his equipment, making his way back to the boat. As he emerged from the jungle, the first drops of rain began to fall, cool against his sweat-soaked skin. The boat ride back was rough, the waves churning beneath a leaden sky. Nathan sat hunched over his samples, lost in thought. He didn't notice the bird until it was too late, a sudden thud against the cabin window. He looked up, startled, but saw nothing beyond the rain-streaked glass. Shaking his head, he turned his attention back to his work, unaware of the faint traces of fungal growth on the bird's lifeless body as it drifted away on the tide. Part 2. Evolution of the Cordyceps. The room was cold and sterile, its white walls lined with shelves of preserved specimens. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the space as Dr. Nathan Wells adjusted his glasses, flipping through a thick journal brimming with sketches and notes. His fingers traced a detailed illustration of an ant with a fungal stalk protruding from its head, a grim reminder of his time on the island. Years had passed, but the memories were vivid, etched into his mind like scars. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the faint ache of exhaustion settling into his shoulders. His research had garnered attention in the scientific community, sparking debates and admiration in equal measure. His paper on the island's fungal ecosystem, especially the cordyceps, had been hailed as groundbreaking. Yet, amidst the accolades, a nagging unease lingered. The island was a mystery he had only begun to unravel, and its secrets haunted him. A soft ping from his computer broke his reverie. Nathan leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he read the headline of an email. Unusual animal behavior on California coast. Link to cordyceps. Attached were video clips of erratic behavior in small mammals. A raccoon spun in circles, its movements jerky and unnatural. A colony of bats hung motionless, their eyes glassy, wings twitching sporadically. He shook his head, closing the email. Coincidence, he muttered, though his voice carried little conviction. His rational mind sought other explanations, disease, environmental toxins, but the images clung to him like a shadow. The following week, Nathan packed his gear with mechanical precision. The decision to return to the island hadn't come easily. He told himself it was to gather more data, to verify his theories, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. The island had a pull, a sinister allure that demanded his return. The boat rocked against the waves as Nathan approached the island. The familiar outline of dense jungle rose before him, a green monolith shrouded in mist. But something was different. The air seemed heavier, the atmosphere oppressive. The cries of seabirds were fewer, their absence unsettling. Stepping onto the shore, Nathan felt the crunch of damp sand beneath his boots. He adjusted his satchel, his movements cautious as he entered the jungle. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin like a second layer. A sweet, rotting smell wafted through the trees, faint but persistent. The jungle was alive, but not in the way he remembered. The vibrant cacophony of insects and birds was muted, replaced by an eerie stillness punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves. Nathan's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, his heart pounding. Every step felt intrusive, as though the jungle itself were watching him. He stopped abruptly, crouching to examine a trail of ants weaving across the forest floor. The sight should have been mundane, but something was off. The ants moved erratically, their paths disjointed. Nathan's breath caught as he noticed fungal growths sprouting from several of their heads, spore capsules pulsating faintly. He leaned closer, his gloved fingers tracing the trail to its source. His gaze landed on a mouse. It stood unnaturally still, its fur patchy and dull. As he watched, the creature convulsed, its body writhing in jerks. A thin white stalk began to push through the top of its skull, the grotesque growth splitting the skin. Nathan stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. It wasn't just ants and spiders anymore. The fungus had evolved, adapting to larger hosts. He recorded the scene with trembling hands, his mind racing. How had this happened so quickly? The island had been a self-contained ecosystem, its fungal evolution slow and deliberate. Yet now, it seemed the cordyceps was racing ahead, pushing its boundaries in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he ventured deeper, the transformations became more pronounced. A cluster of rats scurried across a fallen log, their movements unnervingly coordinated. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies twitching in unison as though controlled by a single will. Nathan watched, horrified, as one rat lunged at another, its teeth sinking into its companion's flesh. The injured rat collapsed, and within moments, fungal growths erupted from its wounds. Nathan's breaths came shallow and fast. He scribbled notes furiously, his mind a cacophony of theories and fears. The fungus wasn't just infecting, it was turning its hosts into weapons, tools for its survival and spread. The forest opened into a clearing, and Nathan froze. The scene before him was nightmarish. The ground was littered with the remains of animals, raccoons, foxes, even a few small deer. Their bodies were contorted, their limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Fungal stalks sprouted from their corpses, their spore capsules bursting with a faint hiss. The air shimmered with the faintest hint of spores, visible only when the sunlight broke through the canopy. Nathan covered his mouth with a scarf, his movements frantic. He knew the risks of exposure, but he couldn't tear himself away. He moved cautiously through the clearing, documenting everything. Each body told a story of infection and death, a grotesque timeline etched into the earth. Then he heard it, a low growl, guttural and wet. Nathan turned, his heart slamming against his ribs. A coyote stood at the edge of the clearing, its fur matted and its eyes wild. Fungal growths covered its back, trailing down its legs like veins. The creature's lips curled back, revealing blood-stained teeth. Nathan froze, his body rigid with fear. The coyote lunged, its movements erratic but terrifyingly fast. Nathan stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding its snapping jaws. He scrambled for his satchel, pulling out a flare gun. His hands shook as he fired, the flare igniting in a burst of light and smoke. The coyote yelped, retreating into the shadows. Adrenaline surged through Nathan's veins as he fled the clearing. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The fungus wasn't just evolving, it was thriving, its reach extending far beyond what he'd thought possible. By the time Nathan reached the shoreline, his body was drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. The boat bobbed gently against the dock, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. He cast one last glance at the jungle, its dense canopy hiding the horrors within. The sweet, rotting smell lingered in his nostrils, a haunting reminder of what he'd seen. As the boat pulled away from the island, Nathan sat hunched over, his head in his hands. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him, a suffocating realization of the danger the fungus posed. The island wasn't just a curiosity, it was a ticking time bomb, one he had unwittingly helped set in motion. Part 3. The crew's descent. Dr. Nathan Wells stared at the collection of faces gathered around the conference table in his lab. The room, usually alive with the hum of computers and the clink of glass vials, now felt charged with tension and purpose. Nathan's eyes moved from one member of his assembled team to the next, a diverse group of scientists, documentarians, and security personnel. Each had been carefully selected for this expedition. "This island," Nathan began, his voice steady but weighted, "is unlike anything else on Earth. What we document here could redefine our understanding of parasitism, ecology, and evolution. But it is also dangerous. Very dangerous. His words hung in the air, and he noticed the subtle shifts in the room. A botanist, Dr. Elaine Carter, adjusted her glasses nervously. Ben Turner, a broad-shouldered security expert, crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Behind them, Marcy Huang, the documentary filmmaker, fiddled with her camera gear, her usual cheerful energy dampened by the gravity of Nathan's tone. There are strict protocols, Nathan continued, and no deviations. The suits stay on at all times. No direct contact with the environment, no unfiltered air. If anyone feels unwell, they report it immediately. Understood? A murmur of agreement rippled through the team, though Nathan caught the flicker of doubt in their eyes. He pushed down his own unease. The journey to the island was uneventful, the rhythmic slap of waves against the boat lulling the crew into an uneasy calm. Nathan stood at the bow, the salty wind whipping his face. As the island loomed closer, his chest tightened. The sight of its jagged cliffs and dense jungle canopy brought memories rushing back, memories he'd tried to bury. The team disembarked in silence, the crunch of boots on the wet sand the only sound. Nathan surveyed the shoreline, noting how the vegetation seemed to have crept closer to the water's edge since his last visit. He shook off the thought and motioned for the crew to follow. The air grew heavier as they ventured into the jungle. Protective suits rustled as the team moved, their breathing amplified by the filters in their helmets. Around them, the forest pulsed with a strange, almost predatory energy. Elaine knelt to examine a patch of bioluminescent fungi, her gloved fingers hovering over the glowing caps. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her voice crackling through the comms. "Beautiful, but deadly," Nathan reminded her. "Collect your samples quickly." Marcy's camera whirred as she captured the surreal landscape. "It's like something out of a sci-fi movie," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Nathan wanted to share her wonder, but unease gnawed at him. The forest felt different, more alive, more aware. Hours passed as the team cataloged the island's grotesque ecosystem. Rats scurried through the underbrush, their movements jerky and unnatural. Fungal stalks jutted from trees like grotesque sculptures, releasing faint clouds of spores that sparkled in the sunlight. "Over here," Ben called, his voice low but urgent. The team gathered around a clearing where the remains of a deer lay sprawled. Its body was bloated, fungal growths sprouting from its eyes and mouth. Elaine recoiled. "This isn't normal. The level of infection, it's advanced." Nathan's stomach churned as he examined the corpse. The fungus had evolved, spreading faster and more aggressively than before. He jotted notes with shaking hands, his mind racing with questions. How far could it go? The first sign of trouble came late in the day. Marcy stumbled, catching herself on a tree. "I'm fine," she said quickly, brushing off concerned looks. But Nathan noticed her labored breathing, the slight tremor in her hands. By nightfall, more cracks began to show. Elaine complained of a pounding headache. Ben's usually steady demeanor had turned irritable, his voice snapping through the comms. Marcy grew quieter, her movements sluggish. Nathan tried to reassure himself. It was exhaustion, the strain of the unfamiliar environment. But deep down, he knew better. The following morning brought chaos. Marcy was the first to break. She woke screaming, clawing at her helmet. "It's crawling inside me," she shrieked, her voice raw with panic. Ben and Elaine restrained her, their voices frantic. Nathan watched helplessly, his mind racing for answers. When Marcy's convulsions stopped, she lay still for a moment. Then her body jerked upright, her eyes vacant. "Marcy?" Elaine whispered, but there was no response. Marcy lunged. The movement was sudden, violent. She knocked Elaine to the ground, her hands clawing at the other woman's suit. "Get her off!" Elaine screamed, her voice breaking. Ben tackled Marcy, pinning her to the ground. Her strength was unnatural, her limbs thrashing with inhuman force. Nathan's hands shook as he raised a tranquilizer gun, firing a dart into her neck. Marcy went limp, but the damage was done. Elaine's suit was compromised, a tear in the fabric exposing her arm. She stared at the wound, her breathing shallow. "It's in me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nathan's mind raced. We have to leave. Now. The team scrambled toward the shore, but the jungle seemed to close in around them. Elaine's condition deteriorated rapidly. She stumbled, her movements erratic. Nathan tried to help her, but she shoved him away. Stay back, she gasped. I'm not myself. Nathan watched in horror as fungal growths began to emerge from her skin, her body convulsing with every step. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. Go. He hesitated, guilt and fear warring within him. Then he ran. Ben was the next to fall. The spores had spread through the air, infiltrating even the smallest breaches in their suits. He collapsed mid-stride, his body writhing. Nathan didn't look back. By the time Nathan reached the boat, he was alone. His suit was intact, but his mind was fractured, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. He cast off from the shore, the engine sputtering to life. The jungle faded into the distance, its horrors obscured by mist. Nathan gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his face pale and drawn. Tears streaked down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. The faces of his team haunted him. Elaine's resignation, Ben's final moments, Marcy's transformation. He had led them into this nightmare, and he had left them behind. The island disappeared from view, but its shadow lingered. Nathan knew he couldn't escape it. As the boat cut through the waves, he sat hunched over, his hands trembling. The weight of what he had seen pressed down on him, suffocating. He had underestimated the fungus, its capacity for adaptation and destruction, and now, he feared, it was only the beginning. Part 4. A Call for Destruction. Nathan Wells stood at his desk, the dim light of his study casting shadows across his face. The room was a chaotic jumble of notebooks, folders, and samples, remnants of his obsession. His fingers traced the edges of a cracked glass vial, the last remnant of his ill-fated expedition to the island. Memories of his crew haunted him, their faces flickering like ghosts in his mind. He had left them behind, and he couldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. He opened his laptop, its glow illuminating his haggard features. Another email drafted to a research institute, this time with footage from his documentary crew's cameras. His hand hovered over the send button, hesitating. He had sent dozens like it already, each met with the same response: silence, dismissal, or polite skepticism. Nathan exhaled sharply and pressed send. As the email disappeared into the void, he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. They don't understand, he muttered. They won't until it's too late. In the following weeks, Nathan's warnings seemed to gain eerie validation. News reports trickled in of strange animal behavior along the California coastline. Coyotes attacking without provocation, birds flying erratically, crashing into buildings and vehicles. A fisherman described an encounter with a group of rats behaving as if under a spell, their glazed eyes and jerky movements etched into his memory. Nathan watched the reports with a growing sense of dread. He knew what they were, even if the world didn't yet. The fungus was creeping toward the mainland, carried by the wind, the waves, and perhaps something more. Desperate to act, Nathan reached out to anyone who would listen. Scientists, government agencies, environmental watchdogs. He attended conferences, presenting his findings with grim determination. Yet, every room he entered was filled with the same skeptical expressions, the same murmurs of disbelief. It's a localized phenomenon, Doctor. Wells, one official had said, his tone dismissive. We appreciate your concerns, but there's no evidence that this poses a broader threat. No evidence? Nathan had snapped, his voice rising. Look at the footage. Look at the samples. This isn't contained. It's spreading, evolving faster than anything we've seen before. The official merely shook his head. Thank you for your time. Nathan left the meeting that day with a sense of rising fury and helplessness. The bureaucracy, the willful blindness, it was maddening. He wasn't just fighting the fungus. He was fighting the world's indifference. Determined to escalate his efforts, Nathan took more drastic steps. He returned to the island's shores, using a drone to capture updated footage of the carnage. The jungle had transformed into a grotesque nightmare. Fungal stalks stretched higher than before, their spore clouds drifting lazily in the humid air. Animal corpses littered the forest floor, their bodies twisted into unnatural poses as fungal growths consumed them. The footage was undeniable. It painted a picture of a living, breathing apocalypse. Nathan paired it with the samples he had collected: infected rodents, spore residue on driftwood, and water samples teeming with fungal particles. He packaged it all, crafting a portfolio too horrifying to ignore. With this arsenal, he aimed higher. A letter to the U.S. government, calls to federal agencies. Finally, a direct appeal to the White House. Weeks passed in tense silence. Nathan's nerves frayed, each passing day a cruel reminder of the spreading threat. Then, late one evening, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Dr. Wells, this is the office of the President. We've reviewed your materials. The President would like to meet with you." The Oval Office felt surreal, its grandeur a stark contrast to the grim purpose of Nathan's visit. He stood before the President, his hands clasped tightly around a flash drive containing his presentation. The room smelled faintly of leather and wood polish, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of papers. "Dr. Wells," the President began, his tone measured, "your claims are extraordinary. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I hope you've brought it." Nathan nodded, his throat dry. He connected the flash drive to a nearby laptop, the screen coming to life with the footage he had captured. As the video played, the room grew colder. The images of infected animals, the fungal spread, the eerie coordination of the infected, it was undeniable. "This," Nathan said, his voice trembling with urgency, "isn't just a threat to that island. It's a threat to the entire world. The fungus is evolving, adapting to warmer hosts. If it reaches the mainland, it won't stop. It will spread, unchecked, until there's nothing left." The President leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You're suggesting we destroy the island." "I'm not suggesting," Nathan replied, his voice firm. "I'm begging. A controlled nuclear strike is the only way to eradicate it completely. We can't take chances." The President exchanged a glance with an advisor, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're asking for a drastic measure. The fallout, the environmental impact, these are not decisions we take lightly." "And if you don't act?" Nathan countered, his voice rising. "If it spreads? What then? There won't be a world left to protect." The room fell into a heavy silence. Finally, the President nodded. "We'll begin preparations." News of the planned strike leaked quickly, and with it came outrage. Environmental groups rallied against the decision, arguing that the island was a unique ecosystem worth preserving. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, their chants echoing in the streets. "Destroying the island is an ecological crime," one protester shouted into a microphone. "We can't let fear dictate our actions." Nathan watched the coverage with a mix of frustration and despair. He understood their passion, but they didn't see the bigger picture. This wasn't about preserving an ecosystem. It was about survival. The delays mounted as legal challenges and political infighting slowed the operation. Nathan's anxiety grew with each passing day. The fungus wasn't waiting. Every moment of inaction brought it closer to an irreversible catastrophe. As the protests escalated, Nathan found himself the target of public ire. His name was plastered across headlines, his reputation dragged through the mud. Fearmonger, they called him. Doomsday prophet. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the strike. He spent sleepless nights monitoring reports, his heart sinking with each new sighting of erratic animal behavior. The signs were there, clear as day, yet the world hesitated. Finally, after weeks of delays, the President made the announcement. The island would be destroyed. The operation would proceed despite the opposition. Nathan allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The nightmare wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. He stood by the window of his lab that evening, staring into the darkness. The weight of what was to come pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had fought to protect the world, but at what cost? As the wind howled outside, Nathan whispered to himself, "This has to work. It has to." Part 5. The Environmentalist Resistance. The chants began as a low murmur, swelling into a deafening roar as more protesters poured into the plaza. Hand-painted signs jutted above the sea of people, their messages stark and impassioned. Save the island. Protect the ecosystem. Science over fear. The air smelled of sweat and sunscreen, the hot California sun beating down on the crowd. Nathan Wells stood behind a window in a nearby government building, staring down at the chaos with a mix of exhaustion and despair. His face was pale, his hair unkempt, and his hands trembled as they clutched a folder of reports. Behind him, an aide was speaking in clipped tones, but Nathan wasn't listening. His focus was on the crowd, their faces twisted in anger, their fists raised in defiance. "They don't understand," Nathan muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. The aide glanced at him. "They think you're destroying a natural wonder. You've become the villain in their story." Nathan turned sharply, his eyes bloodshot. "This isn't about politics or optics, it's about survival. That island is a ticking time bomb, and every second we waste is another second closer to disaster." The aide opened his mouth to respond, but Nathan waved him off, his frustration boiling over. He turned back to the window, his chest tightening as he spotted a young woman holding a sign that read, "Nature knows best." She couldn't have been older than 20, her face alight with conviction. For a fleeting moment, Nathan envied her ignorance. The protests weren't just in the streets, they were in the headlines, the airwaves, the endless scroll of social media. Environmentalist groups had taken the cause global, painting the island as an untouched Eden, a vital piece of Earth's biodiversity. "The island is a treasure trove of undiscovered species," one activist proclaimed during a televised debate. "We can't let fear lead us to destroy it. If Dr. Wells wants to blow it up, maybe we should question his motives." Nathan sat in his darkened living room, the flickering light of the TV casting shadows across his face. He felt like he was drowning, his voice lost in a sea of misinformation and denial. He reached for the remote, his hand shaking, and turned the TV off. The silence that followed was oppressive. The next morning, Nathan awoke to find his inbox flooded with hate mail. Death threats mingled with scathing accusations. "Murderer," "corporate shill," "eco-terrorist." Each word was a dagger, though he tried to ignore them. His focus had to remain on the task at hand. As the protests reached a fever pitch, Nathan received a call from a colleague in a coastal research lab. The voice on the other end was strained, urgent. "We've been seeing unusual behavior in the local wildlife," the colleague said. Nathan's heart sank. "What kind of behavior?" "Raccoons, coyotes, even some seabirds. They're not acting right. Aggressive, erratic. And we found one dead, Dr. Wells. It had growths." Nathan felt the room spin. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "Send me everything you have. Samples, photos, everything." The data arrived within hours, and it confirmed Nathan's worst fears. The fungus had begun to creep beyond the island, hitching rides on ocean currents and wind patterns. He presented the findings to the president's advisors, his voice trembling with urgency. "We're running out of time," he said, his palms flat against the conference table. "These outbreaks? They're just the beginning. If we don't act now, the entire coast will—" An advisor cut him off. "Dr. Wells, we understand the urgency, but the public outcry has made this complicated." Nathan's fists clenched. "Complicated? This isn't politics. It's survival." Meanwhile, the environmentalist movement escalated. Protests turned into sit-ins, activists chaining themselves to government buildings and staging dramatic demonstrations. One group released a series of glossy videos showcasing the island's beauty: mist-covered jungles, crystalline waters, and shimmering fungi. The narrative was clear. This was paradise, and Nathan Wells was the devil intent on destroying it. Public sentiment began to shift. Politicians wavered, their support for the strike eroded by mounting pressure. Legal challenges delayed the operation, each injunction another blow to Nathan's resolve. Nathan grew increasingly desperate. He spent sleepless nights poring over data, refining his arguments, preparing for yet another round of bureaucratic battles. But every delay felt like a nail in the coffin. Each passing day, another victory for the fungus. Then came the tipping point. Reports of localized panic began to surface. In a small coastal town, a coyote attacked a group of hikers, its body covered in strange growths. In another, a fisherman was hospitalized after being bitten by a raccoon behaving like it was possessed. The incidents were isolated, but they painted a grim picture. Nathan called an emergency meeting with the president's advisors, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "We're out of time," he said, his tone devoid of its usual fire. "The fungus is spreading. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to contain." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the gathered officials. Finally, the president spoke. "Prepare the strike. No more delays." The announcement sent shockwaves through the nation. The president's decision was met with equal parts relief and outrage. Protesters flooded the streets, their chants reverberating like thunder. "No nukes! Save the island! Wells must go!" Nathan avoided the news, the vitriol too much to bear. Instead, he focused on ensuring the operation's success. He reviewed maps, analyzed fallout projections, and monitored weather patterns. Every detail had to be perfect. There was no room for error. On the day of the strike, Nathan stood in the control room of a military base, his heart pounding as the countdown began. The tension was palpable, the room filled with grim faces and hushed voices. Nathan's eyes were fixed on the screen, which displayed a satellite view of the island. 10 seconds, someone announced. Nathan's hands trembled. His breath caught in his throat. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The screen lit up as the missile hit its target, a blinding flash consuming the island. The jungle was obliterated in an instant, the shockwave rippling outward and sending plumes of ash and debris skyward. The room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes were on the screen, where the island had been reduced to a smoldering ruin. Nathan exhaled, his body sagging as relief washed over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "Is it really over?" Part 6. The Calm Before the Storm. The sun filtered through the blinds of Nathan Wells' modest apartment, casting long golden streaks across his cluttered desk. Piles of books, journals, and half-empty coffee cups created a chaotic nest around his laptop, the screen open to a document titled "Through the Fungal Veil, A Scientist's Descent." Nathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed the last sentence of the chapter with deliberate precision. With a heavy sigh, he saved the document and closed the laptop. It had been weeks since the nuclear strike obliterated the island. Weeks since he had watched the satellite footage of the explosion consuming the jungle in a brilliant, apocalyptic flash. The image haunted him, but it also gave him a grim sense of closure. The world believed the crisis was over, and Nathan tried to let himself believe it too. The memoir was part of his attempt to move forward, a way to process the horror, to warn others of nature's capacity for destruction. Yet, every word he wrote felt like an admission of failure, a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the unknown toll of the fungus's final days. Los Angeles stretched out beyond the window, its skyline shimmering in the midday haze. Nathan sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him as he scanned the morning news on his phone. Most headlines were innocuous: political drama, celebrity gossip, economic fluctuations. But one headline gave him pause: "Mysterious animal attacks reported near Echo Park." Nathan's brow furrowed as he clicked the link. The article described a series of incidents involving pets and wildlife behaving aggressively. A jogger claimed a raccoon had leapt at her from a tree, its eyes glassy and unfocused. A dog walker reported his terrier snapping at him without provocation before collapsing in a seizure. The report sent a chill through Nathan, but he told himself it was nothing. Animal behavior could be erratic for countless reasons: disease, stress, urban encroachment. He closed the article, pushing the thought aside. Still, a sense of unease lingered as he returned to his desk. Over the next few days, the reports became harder to ignore. Headlines about strange animal behavior multiplied, each more bizarre than the last. Social media buzzed with blurry videos of squirrels convulsing on sidewalks, cats staring motionlessly into corners, and flocks of pigeons spiraling downward like stones. Nathan sat at his desk, scrolling through the footage, his heart pounding. He knew the signs, the erratic movements, the vacant eyes, the spasms. But the possibility seemed unthinkable. The island had been destroyed, the spores eradicated. How could it have reached the mainland? He found himself pacing the small living room, his mind racing with possibilities. His breath quickened as memories of the island flashed through his mind. The stalks bursting from animal corpses, the haze of spores shimmering in the sunlight. No, he muttered, shaking his head. It's not the same. It can't be. Yet doubt gnawed at him, a cold, creeping dread that refused to be silenced. The next evening, Nathan sat alone in the dark, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop screen. A video had surfaced on social media, posted by a teenager near Griffith Park. In the shaky footage, a man staggered through the park, his movements jerky and unnatural. His clothes were torn, and his skin appeared mottled, as if something beneath it struggled to break free. He turned toward the camera, his mouth opening in a silent scream, before collapsing to the ground. The video cut off abruptly, but not before capturing the faint outline of fungal growth sprouting from the back of his neck. Nathan's blood ran cold. He replayed the video 3 times, his stomach twisting with each viewing. It was unmistakable. The fungus had adapted. He barely slept that night, his dreams filled with images of the island, of his infected crew, their vacant eyes staring through him, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways. He woke with a start, his chest heaving, the sheets soaked with sweat. The morning brought no relief. His inbox was flooded with forwarded videos, articles, and panicked messages from colleagues who had seen the same signs. One email stood out. It was from a researcher at a hospital in downtown Los Angeles. Subject: urgent, unexplained cases in ER. Dr. Wells, we've had 3 patients come in today with strange symptoms, aggressive behavior, fever, and what looks like fungal growth around the eyes and mouth. 2 of them have become completely unresponsive. We're running tests, but I thought you should know. Nathan stared at the email, his hands trembling. His worst fear had been realized. By mid-afternoon, the media frenzy had begun. News channels ran clips of emergency responders in hazmat suits cordoning off a section of downtown. A local reporter stood outside a hospital, her face pale and voice shaky. Authorities have yet to confirm the cause of the outbreak, she said, but witnesses describe patients exhibiting violent behavior before collapsing. Officials are urging residents to stay indoors and avoid contact with any individuals showing unusual symptoms. Nathan sat motionless in front of the TV, the remote clutched in his hand. His mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. How had this happened? Had spores reached the mainland through birds, ocean currents, wind patterns? The possibilities were endless, and the answers felt maddeningly out of reach. He replayed the satellite footage of the nuclear strike in his mind, the blinding flash, the mushroom cloud. He had believed it was enough. But now, watching the chaos unfold in Los Angeles, he realized how naive he had been. That evening, Nathan stood by the window, staring at the city below. Sirens wailed in the distance, their mournful cries cutting through the oppressive silence. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights sweeping the dark streets. His phone buzzed on the counter, but he ignored it. He couldn't bring himself to face the flood of messages and calls. A faint glow from the TV drew his attention. A live feed showed a section of downtown, the camera shaking as the crew fled from an unseen threat. In the background, figures lurched through the streets, their movements unnatural, their bodies writhing as fungal stalks emerged from their heads. Nathan's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his head in his hands. The enormity of the situation crushed him, the weight of guilt and dread threatening to suffocate him. He had fought so hard to stop the fungus, to contain it. But it had outpaced him, evolving in ways he hadn't anticipated. And now, it was here. The camera feed cut to static, and Nathan closed his eyes. The world he had tried so desperately to save was crumbling, and he could do nothing but watch. Part 7. Humanity's Last Stand. The world burned, but not in the way Nathan Wells had expected. Through the cracked windows of his lab, he could see the city below unraveling into chaos. Plumes of smoke rose against the dusk sky, black tendrils clawing at the fading sunlight. Car alarms blared, distant screams punctuated the silence, and the once bustling streets were now a battlefield of the infected and the desperate. Nathan stood frozen in the doorway, his chest heaving as he stared at the carnage. His lab coat hung loosely on his frame, stained with sweat and streaks of dirt. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the doorframe, his knuckles white with strain. The infection had spread faster than he'd thought possible. Cities fell like dominoes, each one succumbing to the insidious march of the fungus. It was everywhere now, its spores riding the wind, clinging to clothes, embedding themselves in the lungs of the unsuspecting. Nathan shut the door and bolted it, the metallic clang echoing in the quiet lab. The air inside was heavy with the scent of chemicals and disinfectant, the hum of machinery the only sound. His sanctuary, once a haven of discovery, now felt like a prison. His research consumed him. Stacks of papers covered every surface, chaotic scribbles detailing the fungus's life cycle and its terrifying adaptations. Samples sat in glass containers, their contents writhing with growth. Nathan hovered over a microscope, his eyes bloodshot and unblinking, watching as the fungus thrived under every condition he introduced. Except one. Heat. He leaned back, his breath catching in his throat. The last test had been different. He had exposed an infected rat to extreme heat, and the results were immediate. The fungal growths wilted, the spores disintegrated. The host, though weakened, had survived. Nathan's pulse quickened. It wasn't a cure, but it was a chance. He scribbled notes furiously, the sound of pen on paper sharp in the stillness. 56 degrees Celsius, he muttered to himself. Above 56, the fungal cells rupture. Host viability. Unknown. He slumped back into his chair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His reflection in the window startled him. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, and a wild, haunted expression stared back. He barely recognized himself. The next step was clear. He had to get the message out. Nathan rigged a makeshift broadcasting setup, the wires and equipment scavenged from abandoned labs and supply depots. He cleared his throat, staring into the camera. His voice wavered as he began. "My name is Dr. Nathan Wells," he said, his tone measured but urgent. "If you're hearing this, you need to listen carefully. The fungus, the infection, can be stopped. Heat above 56 degrees Celsius kills it. I repeat, heat kills it." He paused, the weight of his words sinking in. "It's not a perfect solution. The process is dangerous, and there are risks, but it's our only chance. Use whatever you have. Saunas, heat chambers, industrial equipment. You must act quickly." Nathan stopped the recording and sent it across every channel he could access. Radio waves, emergency broadcasts, social media, anything that might reach the scattered remnants of humanity. But doubt crept in as he watched the message upload. Would anyone hear it? And even if they did, would they believe him? The first symptom was a faint headache, a dull pressure at the base of his skull. Nathan ignored it, focusing on refining his research. But the headache grew worse, spreading like a vice tightening around his temples. By the second day, his joints ached, his muscles heavy and unresponsive. He stared at his hands, trembling slightly as he tried to hold a pen. The skin around his fingernails had taken on a faint grayish tint. Nathan staggered to a mirror, his heart pounding. Dark veins snaked across his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. He touched his throat, his fingers brushing against a small, tender lump at the base of his skull. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Not me. Not now." He sank to the floor, his back pressed against the cold wall. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. The infection had reached him, and he knew what came next. He had seen it in his crew, in the victims in Los Angeles. The loss of control, the mindless violence, the fungal growth bursting forth like grotesque flowers. But then he clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wouldn't let it end like this. He had one last chance, one final gamble. The sauna was an old, creaking relic in the corner of the building's basement. Nathan had stumbled upon it weeks ago, its wood panels warped with age and neglect. At the time, it had seemed inconsequential. Now it was his salvation. He dragged a heavy propane tank into the room, connecting it to a modified burner he had rigged to increase the heat output. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he worked, his breaths shallow and uneven. When the setup was complete, he stood in the center of the room, staring at the temperature gauge mounted on the wall. It read 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Not enough. Nathan removed his shirt, his pale skin mottled with dark veins. His hands trembled as he cranked the burner to its maximum setting. The flames roared, the temperature climbing steadily. 122 degrees. The heat pressed against him, suffocating, relentless. His vision blurred, his knees threatening to give way. 130 degrees. Nathan collapsed onto the wooden bench, his body drenched in sweat. Every breath burned, the air searing his throat and lungs. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the world. 135 degrees. He leaned back, his head resting against the wall. The edges of his vision darkened, his consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was a faint curl of steam rising from his skin, the heat enveloping him like a fiery cocoon. And then there was nothing. Part 8. The Cure and the Cost. Nathan Wells woke to the sharp bite of cold air against his skin. His body felt leaden, every muscle aching as though he'd been pulled through fire. He blinked against the dim light filtering through the cracked sauna door, his vision swimming before settling into focus. The wooden bench beneath him was damp, soaked with sweat and condensation. The air in the room was stifling, but he no longer felt its oppressive heat. He raised a trembling hand to his neck, his fingers brushing the spot where the infection had first taken hold. The tender lump beneath the skin was gone. The dark veins that had snaked across his chest had faded into pale lines, ghostly remnants of the infection's grip. Nathan sat up slowly, every movement an effort. His head throbbed, his throat dry and raw from the searing air he had forced himself to endure. He swung his legs over the edge of the bench, his bare feet meeting the cool, damp floor. He had survived. The realization hit him in waves, a mixture of relief and disbelief. The heat, over 133 degrees Fahrenheit, had done what no medicine or intervention could. It had killed the fungus. Nathan stumbled out of the sauna, clutching the doorframe for support. The basement was dim, the faint hum of a generator the only sound. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he made his way to a small table cluttered with supplies, bottled water, medical kits, a battered laptop. He gulped down the water, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. His hands shook as he opened the laptop, its screen flickering to life. He typed furiously, his words disjointed but urgent. Heat above 133 degrees Fahrenheit kills the fungus. Survivable for short exposure. Must disseminate widely. Lives depend on this. Nathan attached the message to his earlier broadcast, the one that had reached only scattered survivors, and sent it through every channel he could access. Emergency frequencies, online forums, encrypted servers. It didn't matter. The world had to know. The days that followed blurred into a haze of exhaustion and determination. Nathan's body was weak, but his mind burned with a singular purpose. He scavenged parts to upgrade his broadcasting rig, his movement sluggish but deliberate. He recorded new messages, his voice raspy but resolute, urging survivors to fight back with heat. Saunas, industrial ovens, anything that generates extreme heat, he said into the camera, his eyes hollow but fierce. It's dangerous, but it works. We can stop this. The first responses trickled in, a crackling radio transmission from a group holed up in a gymnasium, using the building's sauna to treat the infected. A grainy video of a family converting a shipping container into a makeshift heat chamber. It was working. People were listening. But the world outside his sanctuary was far from stable. Nathan ventured out sparingly, each trip a calculated risk. The streets were a patchwork of abandoned cars, makeshift barricades, and the scattered remains of humanity's collapse. The infected roamed in packs, their movements erratic and jerky, their bodies twisted with fungal growths. On one such trip, Nathan crouched behind an overturned bus, his breath shallow as he watched a group of infected shamble past. Their eyes were vacant, their mouths slack. Fungal stalks jutted from their shoulders and necks, swaying with each lurching step. Nathan clutched a makeshift flamethrower, a propane torch rigged to an old fuel tank. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the unrelenting fatigue that gripped his body. He waited until the infected were out of sight before slipping through the shadows, his boots crunching softly on the broken asphalt. Word of the heat cure spread, but so did chaos. Survivors fought over resources, propane tanks, heaters, anything that could generate the temperatures needed to kill the fungus. Nathan became a target, his name whispered among desperate groups as both a savior and a scapegoat. "You're the one who started this," a man had shouted during one encounter, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're why my family's gone." Nathan had fled, guilt gnawing at him. He couldn't argue. He had underestimated the fungus, failed to contain it. The world's suffering felt like a weight he could never shed. In pockets of the world, stability began to return. Communities formed around heat sources, using controlled burns to reclaim infected areas. Survivors shared techniques, exchanging knowledge through rudimentary networks. But the cost was staggering. Cities lay in ruins, their streets choked with ash and debris. Entire regions were uninhabitable, overrun by fungal growths that sprouted like grotesque forests. Nathan watched it all from a distance, his heart heavy with a mix of hope and sorrow. He saw the resilience of humanity, their capacity to adapt and fight. But he also saw the scars he had played a part in creating. One evening, Nathan sat in his lab, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop. The generator hummed softly in the background, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. He rubbed his temples, his mind clouded with exhaustion. He clicked through images he had gathered over the weeks. A child smiling faintly as she emerged from a makeshift heat chamber, her skin slick with sweat but free of fungal growths. A man standing before a row of industrial furnaces, his face streaked with soot but determined. Nathan leaned forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the screen. These were victories, small and fragile, but victories nonetheless. That night, he recorded one final broadcast. He adjusted the camera, his reflection staring back at him. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, but there was a spark of defiance in his gaze. "This is Dr. Nathan Wells," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "To those still listening, still fighting, know this: you are not alone. The world has changed, yes, but it is not lost. We have a weapon. We have fire." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The fungus thrives on fear, on complacency, but it can't withstand resilience. It can't withstand heat. Use what you have. Adapt. Survive. Nathan's voice softened, a flicker of emotion breaking through. "We've lost so much. Too much. But as long as we're here, as long as we fight, there's hope." He leaned back, his eyes glistening. The camera continued to roll, capturing the faint tremor in his hands, the weariness etched into every line of his face. Outside, the city lay in ruins. The skyline was punctuated by fungal stalks that towered over the wreckage, their spore clouds glowing faintly in the moonlight. Nathan's broadcast ended, the screen fading to black. In the stillness that followed, the world held its breath. The end.